All right, so last time we finished talking about Augustine, finished up talking about the issues there was in his doctrines, issues that the Catholic Church continued. And so we finished that up, and now we're going back to pretty much the history of all the way from the councils and the people that we went through, Ambrose, Augustine, and just the political part behind it, and how the church affected politics in that time. So the division of empire, after Constantine died, he divided it among 3 of his sons. So 2 of his sons had it in lands in the west, and 1 of his sons had the land in the east. So Constantine II had the land in the west, and Constantius had land in the east. And in the east, Constantius, he banned sacrifices and paganism. And in the east, they were also more tolerant to Arianism. If you remember, Arianism is when they say that God was, or Jesus was created. He is a created being. And Nicene is when they're saying, no, Jesus was always God. He was always part of the Trinity. He was God eternally. So in the east, they were kind of more tolerant for Arianism. They became kind of semi-Arian. So they kind of believed some things about Arianism and denied other things. And the West was really opposed to Arianism and was strictly opposed to Arianism. But the emperors agreed that they're not going to fight about it. They agreed that whoever emperor is in charge, if they're Arian or Nicene, they're going to support whatever perspective they want, whether it's the Nicene faith or the Arian faith. So it was kind of divided. The East was more leaning toward Arianism, and the West was leaning towards Nicene. After that, there's Julian the Apostate. He arose. So this was a nephew of Constantine, and he was put into Caesar in training while the Eastern emperor was the emperor there. He put Julian as a Caesar, so he was prepared to take over the throne once Constantius dies. And as he was growing up, the tutors convinced Julian to return back to paganism as he was growing up. And he kept these views to himself, so he was secretly a pagan, but outwardly he was presenting himself as, this Christian, someone who believes the same way as the empire believes, but secretly he was a pagan. And he was sent to fight the Gauls. If you look at the map, the Gauls is the area of nowadays France. So he was put there to pretty much take over that region, to put some order in that region. And he was very well in his military expeditions, and he earned the respect of the army. Because the army, if you remember in the Romans, it was gloried in military power. And if somebody was a good military leader, those army members, generals, they wanted that guy as their king, as their emperor. And Constantius, the emperor in the east, he got jealous. So he saw that Julian was gaining popularity, so he was saying, Julian, you're going back. But Julian didn't want to go back, so he declared himself as Augustus. So that's the highest order, that's what Constantius was, and Julian declared himself as Augustus in Paris. It was in 360 AD is when he did that. So as Julian was returning to fight with Constantius to take over the throne, Constantius, he dies of natural causes. And before there was a chance for battle or any of that, and right before his death, he pretty much declares Julian as emperor. His dying wish was, may Julian be emperor. And Julian becomes emperor, and he becomes full-on pagan. So he went out with all of this, reestablishing the paganism, the sacrifices, and he moves to Antioch because it was a lot more pagan than Constantinople. That was the capital in the west, in the east. And Antioch was a lot more pagan, so he moves over there. And he withdraws all these funds that were going to the churches at that time. And the lands that were formerly taken from pagans and given to Christians, they were reversed under Julian. So he took away those lands back and gave it back to the pagans. And he was very unpopular among the Christians, and even so with the pagans as well. He was even unpopular with the pagans because he refused to take the glorified status as emperor. Because back then, the emperors, if you remember in the early Roman Empire, they were counted themselves as gods, on par with deity, or those that represent deity. But Julian, he refused to take the title, and therefore even the pagans hated him or disliked him. And Julian, he knew the weak points of Christianity. He knew what makes church division. He knew what to do to divide the church. And so what he does is he lifts the Nicene qualifications and allows all forms of Christianity to be equal. So before him, they were like, semi-Arian, Nicene, but Arianism was completely denied. But what Julian does is he lifts it all up and says, Arians, Niceans, semi-Arians, you're all equal, and you have equal footing in the church. So that causes schisms, and what he wanted is the church to tear itself apart, and therefore for paganism to thrive. That was the goal of Julian. And he rules for only 2 years. And the Sassanid Empire, which is, if you look, it's the one in the dark purple, the one that's bordering the Eastern Roman Empire, which I think says Byzantine Empire there. That it later becomes the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire. But so the Sassanid Empire, it rose up and was infringing on the borders of the Eastern Roman Empire. So he went out to try to defend, and he died in battle at that time. And there were some rumors that it wasn't the enemy that killed him, but it was a Christian from the Roman army that took him out. There's no proof of this. There's no evidence that this happened, but the Christians didn't even deny that because they did not like Julian. So they're like, well, might as well glory in it. We killed him and got rid of paganism in the Eastern Roman Empire. So they didn't try to, prove themselves innocent. They just took it as truth. And he was the last pagan emperor to live from that point and forward. There was no more pagan emperors. And he was kind of a black goat in a sense, or a black goose. Everybody before him, from Constantine, was Christian. He was a pagan, and then after him, they were all Christians past him. Then after that, a couple of years later, there's Theodosius I. Now, he was the last emperor to rule over the East and the West. So once he took rule, he was ruling the East and the West. And what he does is he enforces the Nicene faith, the Trinity, that Jesus is eternally God and he was not created, so that he enforces this faith as official church doctrine. And he was greatly influenced by Ambrose. If you remember, it was the Ambrose of Milan that rebuked him because of the two charioteers guilty of murder that were put to death in Thessalonica. And the city rioted, and 7,000 people were put to death, as an example, by Theodosius. So people know not to riot against the emperor. Ambrose, he says, a Christian ruler should not act this way. He has to be merciful, and Ambrose excommunicates him. And later on, Theodosius, he repents and shows remorse for a period of time. And Theodosius is increasingly influenced by Ambrose and his opinions. And Ambrose was really strongly Nicene in his faith. And also, Ambrose was also the guy that helped Augustine come to faith as well, if you remember that. And so Theodosius is pressed by Ambrose to become a supporter of the Nicene Creed, and he does so. And he was the first emperor to make Christianity the only option in the Roman Empire. So before that, other pagans were tolerated, although they're not official, they were still tolerated. But Theodosius, he shuts down the temples, the pagan sacrifices. He persecutes the Arians, the Donatists, the pagans, anything that is not considered as universal Christianity. And at that time, about 90% were nominal Christians, or they called themselves Christian. So 90% roughly considered themselves as Christians. And in the rural areas away from the cities, those people tended to be more pagan. But overall, it was mostly Christianized. And he was also the emperor that called the Second Ecumenical Council to reaffirm the Nicene faith, and he did so and expanded as well, expanded the Roman Empire, and he was the one that was saying that the Christian faith will not compromise with Arianism, so it's going to be strictly Nicene. And then after that, we're going to go to the fall of Rome and follow after that.